Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. On this edition of the program, we discuss Ukraine's association agreement with the EU. Who wins and who loses? To discuss this and more in London, we have Alexander Mikiris. He's a political commentator and legal expert. We also have Christopher Walker. He's the former bureau chief of the Times in Moscow. Here in Moscow with me is Ben Aris. He's the editor of Business New Europe. And Chris Weaver, he's senior and founding partner at Macro Advisory. All right, gentlemen, let's talk about the association agreement. Alexander Mikiris, before we get into the details, why is the European Union pushed this so hard and so fast? After all, Ukraine is not the most stable country in the world, and that's an understatement.
It's very much part of the politics of the post-Maidan and Maidan situation. The European Union strongly supported the change of power that happened in Kiev in February. The people who came to power said that they were making a European choice. They called themselves Euromaidan. And given the commitment that the European Union made to them back in February, it would have been politically extremely difficult, indeed, if not impossible, to postpone the signing of this thing. I would point out, though, that signing is one thing, ratification is something else, and, of course, actual implementation is something else still. There is going to be a meeting on the 11th of July to discuss that with the Russians. It would have been far better if this had been done before it was signed. We'll just have to see how it works out.
Okay, Ben Aris here in Moscow with me. This has all been called, dubbed the civilization choice. Is this a good economic choice for Ukraine?
I don't think so. I mean, the root problem of all of this is the fact that Ukraine was forced into making a binary choice, go west or go east. And at the end of the day, it lies in the heart of Europe, in between these two economic powers. And that, basic economics, comparative advantage of what have you, is trade. Open and free trade is good for everybody. And so by forcing someone into a bloc which, closes your options to the other bloc, whichever one it is you choose, is economically bad. So this actually works against Ukraine's interests and against everyone in the whole continent. The whole point is to open the barriers and trade.
Chris, jump in.
I think it will come down to how this is implemented, as what the previous speaker said. If it's a situation where Ukraine finds itself in the European bloc and is excluded from Russia trade, then it's a bad thing. If, on the other hand, Russia adapts to this, doesn't put trade barriers, doesn't put restrictions in place, then Ukraine could find itself in a good position. So it really is too early to say whether this is a good choice or a bad choice. To some extent, politically, there was no choice. They had to do it, and the Europeans had to bring them in. I think really now the ball is down on the Russian court, how they react. If they act sort of aggressively with trade restrictions and barriers to trade, then I think that'll be bad for everybody, including for Russia.
Christopher Walker, but Russia may not have any choice in the matter. They certainly will have to raise tariffs. I think it's really quite interesting, Christopher, is that it was, 24 hours or 48 hours before Kiev was going to sign this agreement, and you had the Prime Minister in Kiev said that maybe there should be some consultations with Russia. I mean, that almost turned into a farce. It was farcical.
I think Walker. It was. If you take the other 48 hours after, there's shaky ceasefire for what it was has totally collapsed between Russia and eastern Ukraine too. I think it's impossible to see this treaty as a sort of economic theory exercise. I quite agree with your contributor about this misplacement of Ukraine, binary choices right in the middle when it should have more than that. But on the other hand, we've got to look at it in the wider context. It's not just a very dry, dusty trade agreement. You're not going to get sort of people making investments and such like if heavy artillery is thudding over their head or Sukhoi jets are flying in. It's got to be set against the background of some more wider settlement, and that in that way I think it was rather misplaced to sort of rush along on a Friday, sign it. I mean, it was a little gifty to the new Ukrainian leader. He got, and to the Maidan as well, which was pressing
Christopher,
him.
he got a lot of nice pictures with Western leaders as well, and that was a very interesting photo out there. Alexander McCurris,
Mr. Cameron wouldn't like those.
Alexander, one of the interesting things that if you read the economic side of the association agreement, which really was the trigger for all of the things that we've seen since November of last year, there's no fiscal support in this agreement. There's no money coming from Brussels. This is really austerity here. There's no fiscal side to this. There's no money coming.
It is austerity, but it's even more than that. What it actually requires is the total transformation of the Ukraine's economy so that it is entirely restructured along European standards, with those standards decided for the Ukraine by the European Council and administered and adjudicated by the European Court of Justice in Strasbourg. So we have a situation, in effect, where the Ukraine is actually doling out its sovereignty over its economic affairs to an economic bloc of which it is not actually a member. Now, if we can go also back to the point about trade with Russia and how the Russians are going to react, this is a point I always come back to. Russia and the Ukraine, until this agreement was signed, were in a free trade area. This is something people seem to find very difficult to understand, but they were. Russia and the European Union are not in a free trade area. To the extent that the Ukraine now, by signing this agreement, is becoming part of the European Union's free trade area, it cannot simultaneously be in Russia's. So, tariff barriers, or if we like, the preferential gifts that Russia had given to the Ukraine will end, and the Ukraine will not be in a free trade area with Russia anymore. I cannot see how that's going to change.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Russian side of it here. Ben, let's kind of step back a little bit here. The Ukrainian economy needs a lot of reform. Is this the right formula? Because there's that sticky little problem called the oligarchs.
Indeed. To start by extending the point that Alexander was just making, I mean, the Euromaidan, the European dream, the European future for Ukraine, but actually it's not a European future because the European Union membership is not and never was and probably never will be
on the table,
mainly because Ukraine's agricultural sector is too big and it will swamp the Common Agricultural Agreement and cause problems there. But also, this European Euromaidan idea has led everyone to pull out these charts and say, but look at Poland and, look at the Czech Republic and how well they've done because they've had this European future. But they've also had like $150 billion worth of structural reform funds, to go into infrastructure, and none of that money is on the table either. In fact, the money that's on the table is A, it's debt, and B, it's half as much as the Russian deal. So in the short term, it was a much worse deal. But then going forward, you could say, well, the chapters that would come with eventual European Union membership, even if you're not going to join, if you still go through those chapters, these are useful. And that is a useful process. But like you say, the starting point that Ukraine comes from is horrendous. I mean, of the 15 former Soviet republics, only 2 still haven't even got back to the level they were at 1991. And those 2 are Kyrgyzstan, which has been wrecked by revolution and what have you, and Ukraine. Per capita income.
But it isn't a poor country. It's just been a politics of ruinization.
Well, there's just been nothing. There's been the last 2 decades, be the government orange or blue, whichever camp it was, nothing was done. And so, comparison, per capita income's around 3,500. Against somewhere like Poland, which is 13,000, and Russia, which is about 15 to 17,000. It is a long, long, long way behind.
Chris, but, reflecting upon what Ben just said here, is that wages are going to go even further down now because we'll have the cut in subsidies. I mean...
well, I think over the short term, and by the short term, I mean, several years, then, I think conditions in Ukraine's economy are going to deteriorate and be very tough, and we haven't even seen the start of that yet, if you like, the austerity impact, and we won't see it until... there's some settlement in the east, and the government can get back to some kind of more normal management of the economy and start recording and reporting data correctly, because clearly the data that's being collected now is incomplete and wrong. The economic trend in Ukraine for the next 2 years looks disastrous. And this deal with Europe without a resolution on the Russian side will make that situation a whole lot worse. We've already heard from President Poroshenko in the last couple of days that he's starting to make noise about, well, actually, we're going to need more money. I mean, yeah, there's a surprise.
Started already.
There's a surprise. But also, actually, interesting, President Poroshenko last week in an interview he gave to a TV company said he believes that Russia will have to honour the trade deals that are in place with Ukraine. In other words, he's banking on having both the European deal and continuing with the Russia deals as part of the CIS.
This sounds like Yanukovych, playing both sides against the middle here.
That's what the guy said.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Alexander, if I go back to you in London, can you think of one product, and don't say agriculture because it won't be allowed, what does Ukraine make that the European Union wants?
I can't, well, some vodka.
I can't think of any.
Some vodka, possibly. I can't think of anything else at all, frankly. And I mean, I would go actually...
bullet casings.
Indeed. I mean, I would go actually further than that, and I would actually say that, I mean, there's a lot of product that the Ukraine makes which the European Union doesn't want. I mean, it's very difficult for me to see how Ukrainian industry can reorient itself towards European markets and at the same time carry out this vast structural change which this agreement requires, and without any money to support it in anything like the kind of quantities that would be needed, whilst it is losing the Russian market at the same time. I just don't think this thing adds up at all, frankly.
Ben, you want to jump in?
There is one product, eggs.
Okay.
That Ukraine is a world-class egg producer, but that actually highlights the details of the free trade agreement, whereby, under the terms, as I understand it, the European Union gets immediate and full access to the Ukrainian market. However, Ukraine does not get immediate and full access to the European market, and this is highlighted by the eggs, because the eggs are the one product they can actually make money from, exporting to the West. But
not chocolate.
The terms of the deal are such that there's a cap. There's a limit to about 10% of Ukraine's egg production that can get exported. And the idea is that Ukraine will progressively be given more access to Europe as it puts the reforms into place, which will take years. So the economic benefits are there in the long term if you do the work.
Okay, but Ben, if I go back to Christopher in London, does Ukraine have a long term? I'm befuddled by the timing of all of this.
I'm totally befuddled, in fact, by more than the timing. It really appears that round this table you've got four intelligent men discussing cloud cuckoo land. And at the end of it, the thought of a man sort of driving through a civil war with a van full of eggs, saying, "Don't break the shells. It's all I've got, Gov," is really just beyond the bane. I mean, in a way, we've just got to throw this discussion out of the window. It's too theoretical. It doesn't deal with the situation at the moment. It certainly doesn't deal with the attitude in Brussels. I don't think they're sitting there saying, "Oh, should we give a bit more to that nice chocolate millionaire in Kiev?" They're thinking how they can give less. I seem to remember one figure when we started these discussions back in February was something, wasn't it, 15 billion that the Russians were prepared to put on the table, whereas we couldn't even find anybody who could remember the EU having gone as far as putting 2 on the table. It just doesn't add up. I think we've got to say they signed something, but it is not going to make any difference on the ground to the realities, hard realities, realpolitik at the moment.
Chris, I mentioned earlier, how do we have this association agreement? And I agree with what's been said on this program already. I mean, implementation and adjudication of it. But we still have an economy that is run by oligarchs. Now, how are you going to mesh the two? Because I suppose, in theory, that you have to get rid of the oligarchs. You have to break up these huge business empires. Presumably that's what the European Union is looking at as well.
Well, I suppose on the one hand that's eventually where you go, but you don't do it by breaking up the oligarchs. You do it by trying to create greater diversity in the economy and growing other parts of the economy so there's more of a balance. But that is
also,
just
you've got a country run by an oligarch. The idea,
so
you've got to remember that.
It's far too theoretical. It comes down to the fact that this was a decision that was forced in far too early without any thought other than, let's see, can we stick something on Russia by
Exactly,
doing
yes.
this. And there is clearly no thought whatever into how this is going to work. And now people are beginning to face that and are scratching their heads.
The trade deal was signed because of the politics. It's,
Yes.
If you signed that, then you lock Ukraine into a European future, and by that you defeat Russia. And this is how it's all framed, in these terms. We need to lock Ukraine in and defeat
Is
Russia.
that good for the average Ukrainian family?
No, of course not. Because it's as Chris was saying in London, the situation is a disaster. The country's bankrupt and it's at war.
Alexander, let me go to you in London. I'll play the role of the cynic here. I think a lot of the oligarchs in Ukraine love this idea because they can clean their money, they can clean their reputation, they can find Western partners to make them legitimate business people, quote unquote.
I think that was one reason why the oligarchs have historically supported this. They want access to, they want to be able to put their money in the West, and they want to be able to trade there and be treated in the West as proper, responsible businessmen. And I'm sure that's part what it is. To what extent that is any more the case today, realistically, is of course another question. I think they still think that, but whether that's actually going to happen is another matter. I mean, what Christopher said about this is not anymore really a realistic thing. We're not talking about something that's going to happen in the way that was envisaged a year ago, if it was ever possible, is perfectly true. We have a war going on. We have an economic collapse underway. There is a perennial political crisis in the Ukraine. It's impossible for me to see how any of this is going to make it possible to implement this agreement. Having said that, I don't think we can simply say that this agreement in itself doesn't matter, because it is creating dividing lines within Ukrainian society. And I think that is really what the problem is.
Chris here in Moscow, a cynic would say, is that for the European Union, this is a good deal because Ukraine's cheap. Its assets are cheap. You go in there and you cherry pick what you like, because there's going to be privatization. You could see the attractiveness on the European side because it's not going to be a visa-free zone.
Sure.
It's not going to be a free trade zone. I mean, it's extremely one-sided. Europeans can go in, cherry pick what they like.
Yeah, and also there's a market of 45 million people, and as we've already said in the program, it's currently a one-way street. European goods will be able to enter that market, will be sold to that market, whereas Ukrainian goods, until they reach the required standard, etc., will not be able to come the other way. So of course it's very good for the European Union. It provides a new market right on the doorstep, and for Ukraine, the benefits, they're theoretical, they're very long term. Short term, it is going to exacerbate an already difficult situation, will lead to, industry restructuring, job losses, etc., and probably much tougher austerity than even was envisaged by the already tough IMF package.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ben, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, this thing with cheap assets and investors rushing in, it's actually already happened once. In 2006, there was absolute mergers and acquisition frenzy in the banking sector, and everyone ran into Ukraine and started snapping up banks. And normally when the banks were bought in Central Europe, people were paying 1 times book value, and the valuations in Ukraine went up to crazy prices, like 8 times book. Because of all these things, the country was supposed to grow, and you've got this large population. And what happened? It all blew up, as it has done so regularly.
They just trade. They just have this musical chairs of oligarchs.
It was worse than that, because you had like sensible Western banks coming and buying things, and normally we're going to set up a real business. But it points to the fundamental problem, because it was like less than 4 years later, all these banks are leaving the UniCredit and Raiffeisen and what have you, selling up. And that's the perennial problem with Ukraine, is that it's corrupt to its core. It's actually the most corrupt country in Europe, according to Transparency International. The politics are totally volatile and insane. And the basic conditions for doing any kind of business, be it with Russians, be it with Europeans, simply does not exist. And you had this euphoric experiment where people invested, and they've all turned tail and run. I think it'll be a long time before people are going to go back, before they actually see some sort of certainty. But again, without that investment, you don't get any of the supercharge uppick, to make it attractive.
And the European Union isn't going
and
to
they're
make
not going
that
to put
happen.
any money in.
Okay, gentlemen, let's change gears completely here, because every single one of you, in one form or another, voiced the fact that this is an anti-Russia move. Okay, agreed. So, Alexander, fine. For Russia, there's some military plants in eastern Ukraine, and they're from Soviet era. they're going to have to build new ones in Russia with modern technology, maybe with outside help as well. We have also gas pipelines going around Ukraine, South Stream, for example. Fine, let the Russians go their own way. I mean, if the European Union wants to cut Russia off, Russia has options too, and it's more midterm, not long-term.
Absolutely. I mean, the Ukraine needs Russia far more than Russia needs the Ukraine. Realistically, economically speaking, Russia does not need the Ukraine. The thing that the Ukraine has is the gas pipeline network, the Ukraine's position as a transit country. That is being steadily undermined because of the way in which the Ukrainians have persistently abused it. And however much people in Europe are prepared to go along with this for political reasons, there will come a point too, I suspect, where they will become fed up with this as well. I mean, we've already seen Nord Stream. There's been attempts to sort of slow down South Stream, but I personally think South Stream will come as well. And I don't really think that the Ukraine is economically necessary for Russia, but Russia is absolutely essential for the Ukraine, certainly in the short to medium term, and as I think some people here have said, does the Ukraine actually have a long term?
But yeah, 2 points. So on energy, I 100% agree. I think South Stream is clearly going to get built. The countries that will benefit from it are all pointing to what Germany did after the disruption in 2009. They went ahead and built their own pipe, the Nord Stream, to secure gas. So the issue with Germany was never about security of supply. It was always about the transit route. So I think South Stream absolutely will get built, and eventually I think that position of major energy conduit to Europe will be usurped by Turkey, but that's perhaps another conversation for another day. But coming back to what Peter you were saying about Russia using this crisis and these events perhaps to spur some investment of its own. Obviously from the Russian side, that clearly is the opportunity. As to what will happen again is another thing, but at least the discussions have started, the recognition has started that Russia has in this vulnerable position today because it too has dithered far too long.
Yes. Agreed.
Talking about reforms, talking about Russian investment, and now we have a clear situation of vulnerability because nothing was done. So the discussions have started again, the planning has started, the recognition has started. What we hope for is that in the autumn we'll actually start to see some positive and concrete steps to make this happen.
Man.
I think we shouldn't lose sight as well of exactly what Russia's interest is in the Ukraine. And it's very simple. It's strategic, it's geopolitical. And the example I give, so you understand the Kremlin's thinking, that if Russia were to persuade Hawaii to join the customs union and thereby remove America's major Pacific Fleet base, and then persuade the new king of Saudi Arabia also to join the customs union, and thereby threaten America's access to oil, I'm pretty sure America would immediately go to war. And that's how the Russians feel about this. They were, they were not happy about seeing the Baltic states go into NATO or Poland, but they were kind of like, all right, we'll let that go. But Ukraine was a bridge too far. This is putting NATO forces right on Russia's border, and Putin said, explicitly and repeatedly that this is the motivation. So they drew a line in the sand, and when the diplomatic options closed, with in effect signing this trade agreement, they went to the only other option left to them, which was military. Which, if you take my crazy example, is actually not that insane if you look at it from the Kremlin's point of view.
Well, also, I think, can I just come in there?
Well, please do, Chris.
Because we've got a little bit of an addendum, haven't we, to this agreement, in that Georgia is also involved in it and is named on the charge sheet, as it were, as far as they see it in Moscow, alongside Moldova. And any mention of Georgia, immediately puts Mr. Putin's military prickles up on his back. And I think that, connected with the fact that this is really going to be seen as a major provocation, because this agreement, low-key as it may be, and the signing ceremony wasn't particularly high-key, it was the existence of it and the refusal of Putin's man, as it were, to sign it in the first place started this whole problem. So underneath it may look like a benign little animal, but actually it's causing all the trouble.
It's a benign, useless trade agreement in practical terms, and yet for the Russians it is a serious provocation.
Yes.
With military undertones.
Yeah,
Alexander.
Exactly. And for that reason, I think it's going to take its place in history more, as Ben was talking about, on geostrategic terms than on strictly economic terms, where there are some fascinating aspects to it.
Well, Alexander, I think one of the things that's missed here when we look at this crisis unfolding and with no end in sight, I tend to think that the Kremlin has a long view of things. Number one, this economic association agreement with the European Union in Ukraine, it's not going to work, or it's certainly not going to work out the way it's envisioned. It never does when it comes to Ukraine. I think you can take virtue from necessity here, and it makes, echoing what we just heard from Chris Weaver sitting next to me, is it makes Russia make some hard choices that it's been able to avoid. It certainly needs to modernize its economy even more, and it has to be much more open to investment. I think this is going to be a wake-up call, because the thing is that the West brought this problem into Ukraine where there were already a lot of problems, but it's not Russia's obligation to fix Ukraine. And I think that's what the realization is. I know people are dying in the East, but Russia, its mission is not to fix its neighbors.
Indeed so. And in fact, if you look at the past 20 years, what the Russians have actually been doing is that they've been supporting the Ukraine. They've been supporting it economically. They've been supporting it in some ways politically. Mr. Putin repeatedly speaks of the Ukrainians and the Russians as being one people. And I think if one takes a very hard realpolitik line, there has not in fact been an entirely wise or sensible policy, given the fact that people in Kiev do not reciprocate with this. And I think it's been a distraction for Russia from pursuing what are in some ways its own hard-headed interests. If I may say, one thing I personally think is that Russia had a lucky escape in some ways. The worst possible thing that could have happened for Russia would have been for the Ukraine to have joined the customs union, for example. That would have simply exacerbated the problems in the customs union and created a very difficult and truculent partner there. Now, Russia now has to do all the things that people have said. It's got to press on with the reforms of its economy, strengthen its economic links with countries, real partners to its east and to its west, and move forward. And at the same time, not perhaps entirely forget the people in the eastern Ukraine who are, as we know, fighting and dying.
All right, I want to ask one more question of all of my guests because we're rapidly running out of time. Ben, do you see Maidan 3 on the horizon?
Well, after Maidan, I said, given that the East didn't participate in that change of government, that we were going to see more demonstrations. I didn't expect them to come so quickly and to be so violent. And when this round of fighting is over, I can see there's going to be a lot of residual bitterness. I mean, we've passed the point of no return in so much as you now have lots of people with dead brothers, fathers, husbands, who are going to resent what's happened, and the government is going to have this huge problem of healing the wounds in a country that's sort of very much geographically divided already, and it's going to be, I don't know, it's just the makings of a horrible situation that's going to last for generations.
I think on the economy, we're just only at the beginning, I think, of a very long multi-year period of economic difficulties in Ukraine. We still have to get up to the new parliamentary elections. We know that it has been agreed that the constitution will revert back to the old one, where the new parliament, possibly heavily influenced, if not controlled, by Yulia Tymoshenko, will have a great deal of influence. The austerity programs will be kicking in. I think the cold reality of Dawn is that Ukraine is going to stay in recession for very many years. The conditions will get a lot worse before they get better.
Alexander, Maidan 3.
Well, we are already seeing it in some respects, in the sense that there's resistance already, as we saw in the eastern Ukraine. There was protests against the government in Kiev. People are protesting. There were medical people who were protesting because of corruption in the health service. The Ukraine is such a politically volatile country. Anybody who makes any predictions about how it's going to stabilize, I think we saw Tymoshenko might be the dominant person in the parliament. She and Poroshenko are well-known rivals. They detest each other. So even within the government itself, we're going to see problems. I think it's entirely possible we could see a Maidan 3. We'll see.
Christopher Walker in London.
Yes,
Maidan 3?
I would agree very much with my colleague there. It doesn't sound like a great movie to pack them in, but on the other hand, the taste has been given. Remember what happened in Egypt. Once you've had one successful, as it were, uprising, whatever you call it, you get a taste for another one, because you're not satisfied. It's like that drug addict who can never get quite enough. And I think there will be one. I just think predicting the timing of it is almost impossible at the moment, but it could be coming up very quickly if they don't sort out the fighting in the east.
Yes.
Okay, gentlemen, fascinating discussion. We kind of ended on a pessimistic note, but no wonder we're discussing Ukraine. I want to thank Alexander, Christopher, Ben, and Chris for joining me. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with Voice of Russia.
all of this is the fact that Ukraine was forced into making a binary choice, go west or go east. And at the end of the day, it lies in the heart of Europe, in between these two economic powers. And that, basic economics, comparative advantage of what have you, is trade. Open and free trade is good for everybody. And so by forcing someone into a bloc which, closes your options to the other bloc, whichever one it is you choose, is economically bad. So this actually works against Ukraine's interests and against everyone in the whole continent. The whole point is to open the barriers and trade.
Chris, jump in.
I think it will come down to how this is implemented, as what the previous speaker said. If it's a situation where Ukraine finds itself in the European bloc and is excluded from Russia trade, then it's a bad thing. If, on the other hand, Russia adapts to this, doesn't put trade barriers, doesn't put restrictions.
Situation, the European Union strongly supported the change of power that happened in Kiev in February. The people who came to power said that they were making a European choice. They called themselves Euromaidan. And given the commitment that the European Union made to them back in February, it would have been politically extremely difficult, indeed, if not impossible, to postpone the signing of this thing. I would point out, though, that signing is one thing, ratification is something else, and of course actual implementation is something else still. There is going to be a meeting on the 11th of July to discuss that with the Russians. It would have been far better if this had been done before it was signed. We'll just have to see how it works out.
Okay, Ben Aris here in Moscow with me. This has all been dubbed the civilization choice. Is this a good economic choice for Ukraine?
I don't think so. The root problem of all
in place, then Ukraine could find itself in a good position. So it really is too early to say whether this is a good choice or a bad choice. To some extent, politically, there was no choice. They had to do it, and the Europeans had to bring them in. I think it really now the ball is down on the Russian court, how they react. If they act sort of aggressively with trade restrictions and barriers to trade, then I think that'll be bad for everybody, including for Russia.
Christopher Walker, but Russia may not have any choice in the matter. They certainly will have to raise tariffs. I think it's really quite interesting, Christopher, is that it was 24 hours or 48 hours before Kiev was going to sign this agreement, and you had the Prime Minister in Kiev said that maybe there should be some consultations with Russia. I mean, that almost turned into a farce. It was farcical.
I think Walker. It was. If you take the other 48 hours after, this shaky ceasefire, for it was, has totally collapsed between Russia and eastern Ukraine too. I think it's impossible to see this treaty as a sort of economic theory exercise. I quite agree with your contributor about this misplacement of Ukraine, binary choices right in the middle when it should have more than that. But on the other hand, we've got to look at it in the wider context. It's not just a very dry, dusty trade agreement. You're not going to get sort of people making investments and such like if heavy artillery is thudding over their head or Sukhoi jets are flying in. It's got to be set against the background of some more wider settlement, and that in that way I think it was rather misplaced to sort of rush along on a Friday, sign it. I mean, it was a little gifty to the new Ukrainian leader. He got, and to the Maidan as well, which
Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. On this edition of the program, we discuss Ukraine's association agreement with the EU. Who wins and who loses? To discuss this and more in London, we have Alexander Mikiris. He's a political commentator and legal expert. We also have Christopher Walker. He's the former bureau chief of the Times in Moscow. Here in Moscow with me is Ben Aris. He's the editor of Business New Europe, and Chris Weaver. He's senior and founding partner at Macro Advisory. All right, gentlemen, let's talk about the association agreement. Alexander Mikiris, before we get into the details, why is the European Union pushed this so hard and so fast? After all, Ukraine is not the most stable country in the world, And that's an understatement.
It's very much part of the politics of the post-Maidan and Maidan